So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah! Every year around NFL draft season, you will hear Detroit Lions fans asking a very similar question to one another. Is this particular prospect a Dan Campbell guy? Now, this is a question and a term that has been coined by Detroit Lions fans as somebody that will fit the culture of the team, fit the identity of the team, typically being a team captain or team leader or very highly regarded by his coaches and teammates from college. And not everybody is a Dan Campbell guy, right? If there are off the field issues, you're probably not on the Detroit Lions board. If you are a head case, if you are a difficult player to coach or a difficult player to keep out of trouble, you likely won't be on the Detroit Lions draft boards. But there's a flip side to that for players that are clean off the field, players that are leaders, players that play to a certain style, players that play in a certain way do tend to be very high on Dan Campbell's roster and do seem to be pretty high on their draft boards come draft night. So today, we're going to be taking a look at players that fit the culture. We're going to be taking a look at the Dan Campbell guys of this NFL draft class as players that not only potentially could, but very much likely will be Detroit Lions come the NFL draft. So with that being said, let's kick it off with a couple of edge rushers. The first of which is a player that actually grew up a Detroit Lions fan, that being Darius Robinson, the edge rusher from Missouri. Now, Darius Robinson is 6'5", 290 pounds, played almost entirely on the edge for Missouri last season, where he had 27 quarterback hurries, 6 quarterback hits, 9 sacks, as well as 14 tackles for loss in the SEC. Now, his get-off isn't incredibly quick. I wouldn't say he is the quickest player off the line, but he is really, really strong off the line, and I think there's a lot of qualities to really like. He has a super high motor. He's incredibly strong against the run. He's got good hands. His ceiling is really, really high. And the only real thing I think that it goes against Darius Robinson is, one, that get off isn't incredibly quick. There are probably 10 to 15 edge rushers with a quicker first step than Darius Robinson, but also the fact that Darius Robinson didn't actually start playing football and didn't start playing organized 11v11 football until his junior year in high school. And obviously in those 2 years at high school, he earned a scholarship to Missouri. And in those couple of years at Missouri, he has developed into a potential first-round prospect. He is still very raw. He is still very inexperienced, but I think he has shown flashes, and I think he has shown the potential to be a great player in the NFL and a great complement to what the Detroit Lions have with Aiden Hutchinson and what they have with the rest of their defensive line. Now, what makes Darius Robinson a Dan Campbell guy, again, is the high motor, is the run defense, is the willingness to do the dirty, grimy work in the middle without necessarily having the individual glory of a 15-sack season, right? He's a player that's going to run defend really hard. He's a player that's going to do everything right. He's going to put a lot of pressure on the quarterback. And I think not only does he fit what the Detroit Lions want on a defensive side of the ball from a player, from that standpoint, from a player standpoint, I think from a personality standpoint, right, I believe he was a team captain at Missouri. He's a great leader. He's a guy that, again, grew up a Detroit Lions fan and just gives everything to his team every single play. And when I watch him on the field, he just feels like a player that Dan Campbell would want to coach, that Dan Campbell would want to have on his defensive line. And I do think he is a very high possibility that the Lions take him with the 29th overall selection. Now, another player that I think the Lions are very high on in this draft class, and a player we've talked about before, is Brenden Trask, the 6'4", 274-pound edge rusher from the University of Washington. 53 hurries and 90 quarterback pressures last year, led the college football led college football in both statistics. He had 19 quarterback hits, 8 sacks, and 11 and a half tackles for loss. And again, much like Darius Robinson, I do think Brenden Trask is a Dan Campbell guy. His motor is super high. He's a team captain with Washington. He's a leader. He's got really good hands, really good quickness off the line. He's a great run defender. There really aren't too many things to dislike about Brenden Trask's game. Yeah, he's not the most athletic guy. I believe his RAS score was only somewhere in the mid sevens, which isn't great, but also isn't terrible for an athlete. But again, athletes aren't necessarily the Dan Campbell way, right? They do like their big time athletes. Aiden Hutchinson was a big time athlete. Jahmyr Gibbs is a big time athlete. Jameson Williams, Penei Sewell. A lot of the guys that they take high are really, really strong athletes. But you do have some guys here and there that aren't necessarily the best athletes. You have some guys with some low RAS scores that surprise Lions fandom, but turn out to be pretty good players in the long run anyway. So even though the athletic side of things, the typical high RAS scores are things that Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes alike on their roster, it isn't an end-all be-all. And I do think that the leadership qualities, I do think the motor, I do think the relentless pressure and the relentless effort that he gives on top of being a leader and on top of the quickness and run defense that he has already shown at Washington would make him a really high player on the Detroit Lions board from a personality standpoint, from a, big board standpoint. I think he very much could and will be a member of the Detroit Lions pass rush, because I think if he's there in the second round and the Lions didn't draft Darius Robinson in the first, I think there's a good chance that they trade up for a guy like Brenden Trask. Now, moving over to the secondary, I think there's a couple of really big players in the secondary the Lions could look at on day 2, but my favorite of which is Kyrie Jackson, the cornerback from Oregon, standing at 6'3", 195 pounds. Last year with the University of Oregon, he was targeted just 38 times, allowing 19 receptions for 200 yards with 1 touchdown allowed and 3 interceptions. Now, Kyrie Jackson is not the most, I would say, athletically gifted. His RAS score was, again, somewhere in that middle to high 7 range. But with his size and his length, he doesn't necessarily have to be the fastest player on the field. And I do think he has a lot of qualities that will really stand out to the Detroit Lions and how they like their defensive backs. We know that they like their defensive backs to tackle, and Kyrie Jackson does that really well. Had 5 tackles for loss last year and 2 sacks on top of 34 tackles in the regular season. He's not afraid to step up and make some big tackles. He's not afraid to step up and be physical. He's not afraid to press players. He's not afraid to be physical in the route, nor is he afraid to put his head down and just hit somebody as hard as humanly possible. He does have some really good range as a cornerback. He's got great reach and great length for the cornerback position. Again, standing at 6'3", he is a longer cornerback. And even though he ran in the 4.5s, that couple extra inches on his arms basically makes up for that. Because yeah, he might be a step behind. He might be a half a step further behind than a player like maybe Nate Wiggins would be. But he also has 3 to 4 inches on most of the cornerbacks in this class, which means he makes up for that with his reach. And very rarely does he ever get beat deep, because he's so long and he's so rangy and he does not get beat deep. And pair that with his physicality, I think he is exactly the type of player that the Detroit Lions are going to want on their roster. Big, physical press man cornerback that can tackle, that can step up and tackle for loss, that they can blitz off the edge and get a couple of sacks. This is a Dan Campbell and an Aaron Glenn cornerback, and I don't think there are too many players that fit the bill better than Kyrie Jackson. But another player that potentially could is going to be TJ Tampa, the cornerback from Iowa State. Now, TJ Tampa is a little bit smaller than Kyrie Jackson, hitting at just 6'2", but 200 pounds. He was targeted 49 times last year, where he allowed just 25 receptions for 240 yards, 1 touchdown to 2 interceptions. Now, I think TJ Tampa very well may be the biggest hitter in this draft class. If you're asking a cornerback to step up and hit a running back, hit a tight end, hit a wide receiver, be support in the running game, I think TJ Tampa is your guy. He's a big hitter. He's strong. He's physical. He's scrappy. And much like Kyrie Jackson from the last couple of slides. He isn't the most athletic player, but he does make up for that by being 6'2" and having some really long arms. He has a great reach, and although he's not the physically gifted type as far as speed, he's not going to run in the 4.3s. He's probably going to run in the 4.5s, if anything. His length more than makes up for that, and I think his physicality off the line means that receivers very rarely get a clean release off of him, and there's a lot of times where he is looking like a first-round cornerback. I think if he was a little bit more athletic and had maybe a little bit more ball production, he would be a first-round pick. I still think there's a possibility that he is a fringe first-round pick for somebody like the Detroit Lions or maybe a potential L'Jarius Sneed replacement for the Kansas City Chiefs. But I do think that he would be a really good fit for the cornerback position. He was a leader on the Iowa State defense. Again, he plays the style of football that the Lions want their cornerbacks to play. And I think that if they add him to the secondary, he would be a starter sooner rather than later. And then we have a couple of wide receivers to talk about. And we know that Brad Holmes loves his ex-wide receivers. We know he loves the big body guys, the guys that can stretch the field, the guys that can go up and get it. And I think a couple of guys in this draft class fit that bill. Adonai Mitchell, the wide receiver from Texas, stands at 6'4", 196 pounds with a 9.99 RAS score. Has 4.3 speed, and last year had 55 receptions for 845 yards and 11 touchdowns, while averaging 15.4 yards per reception. This is the definition of a Brad Holmes wide receiver. 6'4", 4.3 speed, good hands, good route running. I think Adonai Mitchell is my personal wide receiver 4 in the class, and I think will be the number 1 wide receiver prospect on the board of the Detroit Lions. Because not only is he big, not only is he fast, not only can he go up and win a jump ball and go up and get the football in a contested situation, he also runs routes really, really well. I think he's potentially the best route runner in this draft class. And pairing that with his 4.3 speed, pairing that with his strong hands, pairing it with his use of leverage and understanding of route combinations, he is such a talented wide receiver. And I know the production hasn't always been there. I know that he has never actually cracked 1,000 yards in college football. But considering the fact that there was some quarterback issues with Texas last season, considering the fact that, Texas had a couple of really good weapons, they had a great running game, and they were able to be very balanced, Adonai Mitchell, I think, was a really impressive player last year, a player that I think the Lions would really want and pair with Jameson Williams and pair with Amon-Ra St. Brown to potentially give them one of the best wide receiving trios in the NFL. Adonai Mitchell, to me, looks a lot like CeeDee Lamb coming out of college. He looks a little bit like Jordan Addison as well when he was coming out of USC and what he looked like with the Vikings last season. And I think he'd be a great addition to the roster. And if he does fall to 29, I think there's a pretty good chance that the Lions go out and they address the wide receiver position early, and they go out and they get a great boundary guy in Adonai Mitchell. Now, another player I think the Lions could very much be interested in is Troy Franklin. Again, a Dan Campbell, Brad Holmes type of wide receiver that's big, physical, fast, and can take the top off of a defense. Troy Franklin said that 6'3", 187 pounds, had 114 targets last year with 81 receptions, 1,383 receiving yards, and 14 touchdowns. Now, he does have a little bit of a drop problem. I believe dropped 10 passes last year, which obviously is not ideal, but also he hauled in 81 receptions for 1,300 yards and 14 touchdowns. He ran in the 4.4s, which isn't as big or as fast as Adonai Mitchell, but he is big and fast. He does have a lot of yak. He does get a lot of tough catches. He is a great football player, but again, his concentration drops are certainly a thing that pops up on film, and it is something that could potentially put him down into the second, maybe even the third round. But I also think his upside of being big, fast, strong, does have some strong hands at times, and is, I think, better at the contested catches than he is at the easy catches, right? I think he, when he has that time to think about it when the ball's coming in, he sometimes does have some concentration drops, but when he's, matched up with a when he's matched up with a defensive back that's really close to him, making it tough, he also tends to make some big catches in some big moments, despite it being a tougher catch than players that he's dropped earlier. So with that being said, I think Troy Franklin is kind of the backup option to an Adonai Mitchell. If they can't get him in the first round, they may bounce back to Troy Franklin in the second round. You may realize that I have a couple of ducks on this list. I do like a lot of the Oregon players this year. Jackson Powers Johnson is another player that could very much be a Dan Campbell guy. And I think that Oregon could be this year's Iowa, right? Players that are from a great program, that played great football last year, that went to a conference championship, weren't quite good enough to win it all, but from a great program, from a great defense, from a great offense, you're getting some of the best players from some of the best units in college football. And I think it's a route that Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes have gone before. And I think it could be a route that they potentially go again. So with all of that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Those are my top culture fits for the Detroit Lions for the 2024 NFL Draft. Those are far from the only culture fits. So if you want to hear about some more players, obviously we can do that in another video. But let me know down in the comments below who your biggest culture fits are. Who do you think is the Dan Campbell guy of this NFL draft? I'd be very curious to you guys have to say and what you guys think. But with all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.